European and American leaders send message to Putin, there is no escaping this. Leading European and American politicians have urged Russian President Vladimir Putin to be held criminally responsible for the war in Ukraine. According to the official translation, Putin must be held accountable for the crime of aggression. Otherwise, history will repeat itself over and over again. U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican, took the same position, arguing that the same will happen again in the future if Putin renounces his actions in Ukraine. Kolos said Putin could be charged with war crimes at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, but not with the crime of aggression against Ukraine. According to her, she needs a separate court. One of the reasons the International Criminal Court is currently unable to take action against Putin is that neither Russia nor Ukraine are parties to the Rome Statute on which this court is based. Addressing Putin, Kolos said that she gives the following signal when a criminal case is initiated. You will be responsible. If an aggressor or potential aggressor anywhere in the world finds out that you do this and nothing will happen to you, this is a serious problem not only for Europe, but for the security of the world. Graham said the West would forgive and not forget, and that is why a European court was needed to prosecute the crimes of aggression. He said U.S. Democrats also support that process. Leading European and American politicians have urged Russian President Vladimir Putin to be held criminally responsible for the war in Ukraine. According to the official translation, Putin must be held accountable for the crime of aggression. Otherwise, history will repeat itself over and over again. On Friday, President Vladimir Putin struck a direct attempt to frustrate Russian gas giant Gazprom, which has been at the center of deteriorating relations between Moscow and Europe over the Ukraine conflict. European countries relied heavily on companies for natural gas supplies, but after Russia sent troops into Ukraine, they began looking for other sources. At a ceremony marking the company's 30th anniversary, President Putin praised the company's efficiency and sustainability. Frankly, despite unfair competition and external direct attempts to slow down and curb development, Gazprom is moving forward and starting new projects, Putin told a group of Gazprom employees via video link. Earlier this week, Moscow announced that gas exports in 2022 would fall 25% year-on-year, blaming European countries for the sharp drop. In response to Russian intervention, Germany has withdrawn permission to build the recently completed Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which will increase Europe's dependence on Russian gas supplies. Instead of, Moscow said gas supplies to China doubled last year compared to the previous year, and it hopes to see further increases in supplies after losing market share in Europe. Russian President Vladimir Putin wants you to believe that NATO was responsible for the February 24th invasion of Ukraine. NATO enlargement has made Russia uncertain, leading Putin to blame him. There are two major flaws in this argument. First, NATO was the variable, not the cause, of the constant tension between Russia and the West. Moscow has recognized Ukraine's right to join NATO in the past. The Kremlin's insistence on alliance has clearly deteriorated since the democratic breakthrough in the post-Soviet space. This highlights the second flaw. Putin fears democracy and the threat it poses to his regime, so taking expanded NATO membership out of the discussion won't lessen his uncertainty. His avowed goal of invasion, the denazification of Ukraine, is in code for his real goal, anti-democratic regime change. Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine sparked Europe's largest war since World War II, resulting in indiscriminate bloodshed by thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and innocent civilians. Russian President Vladimir Putin wants NATO to believe they are to blame. He is not talking about the 200,000 Russian soldiers and sailors who often attack Ukrainian ports, but the NATO expansion. Airfields, roads, railways, and cities are the main drivers of this crisis. After John Mearsheimer's 2014 Foreign Affairs article asserted that the Ukraine crisis was the West's fault, talk of Russia's backlash against NATO expansion has been bolstered by Moscow's ongoing stance on Ukraine. It has become the dominant basis for explaining war. This idea was repeated by politicians, analysts, and writers not only in Moscow, but also in America, Europe, and other countries. They said several expansions added to Russia's insecurities as NATO forces moved closer and closer to Russia's borders, finally propelling Putin into a ferocious attack, first invading Georgia in 2008, then Ukraine in 2014, and now perhaps a second time. On a much larger scale. Invade Ukraine today. So the specter of Ukraine joining NATO points to both the cause and the solution to the conflict. That is, the renunciation of accession to Ukraine is an argument, and future wars will be avoided. There are two flaws in this argument. One has to do with history, the other with Putin's thoughts. First, NATO's expansion has been variable rather than a constant source of tension between Russia and the West. Over the past 30 years, the importance of this issue has been raised and lowered primarily as a result of the wave of democratic expansion in Eurasia, and not primarily because of the wave of NATO expansion. In a very clear pattern, Moscow's dissatisfaction with the alliance has intensified since the democratic breakthrough. The catastrophic invasions and occupations of Georgia and Ukraine gave Putin de facto veto power over NATO aspirations, but since the alliance will never allow Russian forces to partially occupy the country, this fact is a fact that the current invasion is not against NATO, undermining Putin's claim that member. He has already, for all intents and purposes, shown that by blocking NATO expansion, he wants far more important things in Ukraine today: the end of democracy and the return of slavery. On February 24th, he made this clear in an hour-long rant explaining the decision to invade. This reality highlights the second flaw. Because the main threat to Putin and his authoritarian regime is democracy, not NATO, this perceived threat will not magically disappear with a moratorium on NATO expansion. Putin will not stop trying to undermine democracy and sovereignty in Ukraine, Georgia, or the wider region once NATO expansion is halted. As long as citizens of free countries exercise their democratic rights to elect leaders and set their own direction in domestic and foreign policy, Putin will continue to seek to undermine them. Putin's goal of denazifying Ukraine is a code word for regime change, anti-democratic regime change.